The year was 1876. The westbound train rattled through the Colorado mountains, carrying Abigail Harper toward a future she had pinned all her hopes on. 6 weeks of correspondence with Thomas Whitaker, a prosperous rancher in the newly established settlement of Pine Valley, had culminated in a marriage proposal and a one-way ticket west. For a 28-year-old seamstress with dwindling prospects in Philadelphia, it had seemed like divine providence. But the Pine Valley that Abigail arrived at was not the welcoming haven she had envisioned. Instead of a warm greeting, she received a cold assessment. Instead of a wedding, she faced humiliation. And instead of returning east in shame, Abigail made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. This is the story of a woman who journeyed west to become a bride, but instead discovered her own worth in the most unexpected place, through the eyes of a man whose people had known the true meaning of beauty long before settlers claimed their lands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Early autumn painted the Colorado foothills in shades of amber and gold as the stagecoach made its final approach to Pine Valley. Abigail Harper smoothed the wrinkles from her best traveling dress for the third time in as many minutes, her heart fluttering with anticipation. The heavy wool garment, practical for Philadelphia winters, had proven stifling during the journey west, but it was the finest she owned and made the most of her fair complexion and auburn hair. "Pine Valley coming up," the driver called from his perch. Last stop before Dunstan Creek. Abigail peered through the dusty window, eager for her first glimpse of the place that would soon be her home. After the death of her parents to influenza 2 years prior, she had struggled to maintain their modest seamstress shop. When her cousin Martha suggested she consider the advertisements for women of good moral character to join unmarried men on the frontier, Abigail had initially dismissed the idea. But as debts mounted and suitors remained scarce, the prospect had grown more appealing. Thomas Whitaker's advertisement had stood out from the others. Successful cattle rancher, 35 years of age, educated at Harvard College, seeks refined Eastern. Lady for companionship and matrimony, must appreciate literature and music, comfortable home and respectable position in growing community guaranteed. His subsequent letters had revealed an articulate, seemingly thoughtful man who described his ranch in picturesque terms and spoke of his desire for intellectual stimulation lacking in frontier society. He had enclosed a small photograph showing a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard standing proudly before a substantial 2-story house. The stagecoach jolted to a stop in front of what appeared to be Pine Valley's main mercantile. Abigail gathered her reticule and straightened her hat as the driver opened the door. "Need help down, ma'am?" he asked, offering a calloused hand. "Thank you, yes," Abigail replied, accepting his assistance as she navigated the high step down. Her legs, stiff from days of travel, wobbled slightly as they took her weight. Pine Valley was smaller than she had imagined from Thomas's descriptions. A single dirt street lined with weathered wooden buildings stretched for perhaps a quarter-mile. A church with a modest steeple anchored one end, while various businesses, the mercantile, a small hotel, what appeared to be a lawyer's office, and inevitably a saloon, comprised the town's commercial center. A few locals paused in their activities to observe her arrival with undisguised curiosity. Abigail felt suddenly conspicuous in her formal Eastern attire, which contrasted sharply with the practical, sun-faded clothing of the women she could see. "Miss Harper?" She turned to find a young man of perhaps 20 approaching. He had a boy's lankiness, not yet filled out to a man's frame, and his expression held a discomfort that immediately kindled anxiety in Abigail's chest. "Yes, I'm Abigail Harper," she confirmed, offering a tentative smile. The young man removed his hat revealing sandy hair in need of a trim. "Billy Cooper, ma'am. I work for Mr. Whitaker at Crescent Ridge Ranch." He shifted his weight awkwardly. "Mr. Whitaker sent me to fetch you, but he asked that I take you to the hotel first instead of the ranch." Abigail's smile faltered. "The hotel? But I understood I would be going directly to the ranch. We're to be married tomorrow by Reverend Simmons, according to Mr. Whitaker's last letter." Billy's discomfort visibly increased. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Whitaker just asked that you get settled at the hotel first. He'll come by this evening to speak." "With you?" His eyes dropped to the ground. "Said to tell you he'll cover the cost of your room and meals." A sense of foreboding settled over Abigail, but she maintained her composure. "I see. How thoughtful of him to consider I might wish to freshen up after my journey." The young man seemed relieved by her response. "Yes, ma'am, that's it exactly. Let me help with your trunks." The Pine Valley Hotel proved to be a modest two-story structure with clean but spare accommodations. Mrs. Turner, the proprietress, was a thin, weathered woman whose sharp eyes took in every detail of Abigail's appearance as she signed the guest register. "So you're Thomas Whitaker's mail-order bride?" she remarked, making no effort to disguise her assessment. "Heard you were arriving today. Got you in our best room." She handed Abigail a key. "Washroom's down the hall. Dinner's at 6 in the dining room." "Thank you," Abigail replied, maintaining the poise her mother had instilled in her through years of gentle correction. "Could you direct me to a place where I might send a telegram? I promised my cousin I would notify her of my safe arrival." "Telegraph office is next to the Mercantile," Mrs. Turner replied. "Billy can show you after he brings up your trunks." Once alone in her room, Abigail allowed herself a moment of uncertainty. Thomas's instruction that she stay at the hotel rather than proceed directly to the ranch seemed odd, particularly given the definite plans outlined in his letters. Still, frontier customs might differ from those in Philadelphia, and perhaps it was considered improper for her to stay at his home before their wedding. She unpacked her clothing carefully, hanging her wedding dress, a dove-grey silk that had once been her mother's, to release the wrinkles from the journey. The modest trunk contained all that remained of her former life: 3-day dresses, undergarments, a few books, her mother's cameo brooch, and her sewing kit. The larger trunk held fabrics, patterns, and her prized Singer sewing machine, which she hoped might provide additional income in her new community. After washing away the dust of travel and changing into a fresh navy blue dress that complemented her fair skin, Abigail ventured downstairs. Billy Cooper waited in the hotel lobby, still looking uncomfortable but dutiful. "Mr. Whitaker said he'd come by around 7, ma'am," he informed her. "I can show you to the telegraph office now if you'd like." "Yes, please," Abigail replied, gathering her shawl against the late afternoon chill. The walk through Pine Valley offered Abigail her first real look at the community Thomas had described as rapidly developing into a center of culture and commerce. While neat and orderly, the settlement lacked the refinements Thomas had suggested in his letters. There was no sign of the lending library or musical society he had mentioned, and the Mercantile's windows displayed practical goods rather than the quality imports he had described. After sending her telegram, Abigail found herself with time to spare before dinner. "Billy, would it be possible to see Crescent Ridge Ranch from town?" she asked. "I'm curious about my new home." The young man pointed to a distant hillside where a large house was just visible against the backdrop of pine-covered mountains. "That's it up there, ma'am. Mr. Whitaker has the best land in the valley, 2,000 acres, over 300 head of cattle, and that house he built last year. Fine place." He hesitated. "Are you from a big city, Miss Harper?" "Philadelphia," Abigail confirmed, "though my parents' home was quite modest. I've worked as a seamstress since I was 16. Billy nodded, his expression thoughtful but still guarded. "Never been east myself." Born in Kansas, came out here with my folks 5 years ago." As they walked back toward the hotel, Abigail noted several women observing her from the mercantile porch, their heads bent together in conversation that ceased as she approached. Their expressions held a mixture of curiosity and something that uncomfortably resembled pity. Dinner at the hotel was a simple but substantial affair of roast beef, potatoes, and apple pie. Abigail ate alone at a small table, acutely aware of the sidelong glances from the other diners, 3 traveling salesmen and an older couple who appeared to be passing through. Mrs. Turner kept her water glass filled, but offered little conversation beyond the necessary pleasantries. At precisely 7 o'clock, Mrs. Turner approached her table. "Mr. Whitaker's in the parlor," she announced. "Says he'd like to speak with you privately." Abigail's heart quickened. Despite the strange circumstances of her arrival, she was finally about to meet the man whose letters had given her hope for a new beginning. She smoothed her hair, straightened her collar, and followed Mrs. Turner to the small parlor off the hotel lobby. The man who rose from the armchair by the window was indeed Thomas Whitaker. She recognized him from the photograph, tall and broad-shouldered, with a well-trimmed beard and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He was handsome in a conventional way, with regular features and clear blue eyes that now assessed her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice matching the educated tones of his letters. "Welcome to Pine Valley." "Mr. Whitaker," she replied, extending her hand. "I'm pleased to finally meet you in person. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Thomas Whitaker did not offer Abigail a seat. Instead, he circled her slowly, continuing his assessment with the calculating eye of a man accustomed to evaluating livestock at auction. "Your letters described you as of average build," he said finally, his tone clipped and businesslike. Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I believe I am," she replied, struggling to maintain her composure. "At 5 feet 4 inches and 160 pounds, she had always been more substantial than the willowy ideal celebrated in ladies' magazines, but her figure was proportionate and, until this moment, had never been the subject of such direct scrutiny. "Perhaps by Eastern standards," Thomas said dismissively. "Out here a woman needs to be hardy but not," he gestured vaguely at her form, "excessive. The frontier demands efficiency in all things, Miss Harper." The meaning behind his circuitous language became painfully clear as his evaluation continued. "Your photograph showed only your face. Quite strategically, I now realize. Had you been forthcoming about your complete appearance, I would have saved us both considerable inconvenience." Abigail stood frozen, humiliation washing over her in waves. The photograph she had sent had indeed been a portrait showing only her face and shoulders, the only photograph she possessed, taken 3 years earlier on her 25th birthday. There had been no deception intended, merely the limitations of what she had available to send. "Mr. Whitaker," she managed finally, her voice steadier than she felt, "if my appearance does not meet your expectations, perhaps we should terminate our arrangement. I would not wish to disappoint you as a wife." Thomas nodded, seemingly relieved by her practicality. "Yes, that would be best. I've built Crescent Ridge into the finest property in the county. My position here requires a certain type of wife." He removed an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I've taken the liberty of purchasing your return ticket to Philadelphia. The eastbound stage leaves tomorrow at noon." Abigail stared at the envelope, a strange numbness spreading through her. All her careful planning, her hopes for a new beginning, dismissed because her body did not conform to this man's ideal. "And if I choose not to return east?" she asked quietly. Thomas appeared surprised by the question. "What alternative do you propose? You can hardly expect me to honor our arrangement under the circumstances." "I expect nothing from you, Mr. Whitaker," Abigail replied. a spark of pride cutting through her humiliation. "I simply inquire about my options should I decide that returning to Philadelphia is not in my best interest." He considered this briefly. "Pine Valley needs skilled workers of all types. Your letters mentioned experience as a seamstress. That might provide a modest living, though I couldn't speak to whether the community requires such services." His tone made clear he considered the matter no longer his concern. "I understand," Abigail said, her mind already calculating her meager resources and possibilities. "Is there anything else you wish to discuss?" Thomas hesitated, perhaps sensing the careful dignity with which she was navigating this unexpected rejection. For a moment, something like regret crossed his features. "You seem an intelligent woman, Miss Harper. I'm sure you'll find a more suitable situation eventually." He placed the envelope on the small table between them. "The ticket is yours regardless of your decision. Good evening." With that, he departed, leaving Abigail alone in the hotel parlor, the envelope containing her return ticket lying untouched on the table like a silent accusation of failure. Mrs. Turner appeared in the doorway moments later, her expression suggesting she had anticipated this outcome. "Will you be staying with us another night, Miss Harper?" she asked, her tone not unkind, despite its briskness. "Yes," Abigail replied, gathering her composure. "And perhaps longer, depending on what opportunities I might find in Pine Valley. Could you direct me to anyone in need of a skilled seamstress?" Mrs. Turner's thin eyebrows rose slightly. "Not returning east, then?" "Not immediately," Abigail confirmed, lifting her chin slightly. "I've come a very long way, Mrs. Turner. It seems premature to turn back at the first disappointment." The older woman studied her with newfound interest. "Martha Wilson at the Mercantile might know who's looking for sewing work. She keeps track of most everyone's business around here." She paused. "If you're staying, you should know that Thomas Whitaker has considerable influence in Pine Valley. He's not one to accept rejection gracefully, particularly from—" She stopped herself. "From women he's already rejected." Abigail finished with a hint of irony. "I have no intention of creating difficulties for Mr. Whitaker. My only desire is to establish myself independently." Mrs. Turner nodded. "Rooms paid through the week. After that, it's $2 a night, meals included." Alone in her room that evening, Abigail allowed the tears she had suppressed during her meeting with Thomas Whitaker to flow freely. The humiliation of being evaluated like merchandise and found wanting burned deeply. She had endured subtle slights about her appearance before, well-meaning aunts suggesting corsets that might improve her figure, social invitations that mysteriously disappeared when slimmer girls were available, but never such direct rejection. Yet beneath the hurt, another emotion began to take shape: determination. Philadelphia held nothing for her but mounting debts and diminishing prospects. Her parents' seamstress shop had been sold to cover their final expenses, and her cousin's crowded home offered only temporary accommodation. Here, despite Thomas Whitaker's rejection, she at least had the possibility of a fresh start. Abigail removed her mother's cameo from her trunk and held it between her palms, drawing strength from the connection to the woman who had taught her resilience through example. Catherine Harper had maintained their family through her husband's long illness, adapting her skills to changing markets, finding opportunity where others saw only obstacles. "I will not return in defeat," Abigail whispered to the silent room, not without at least attempting to build something here. The following morning, she dressed with particular care in her green day dress with white collar, arranged her auburn hair in a simple but neat style, and made her way to Wilson's Mercantile. The establishment occupied the largest commercial building in Pine Valley, its windows displaying an eclectic array of goods, from practical tools to modest luxuries. Inside, the store smelled of coffee, leather, and the distinctive mix of spices and dry goods that defined general stores throughout the country. A tall, angular woman with iron-grey hair, pulled into a severe bun, stood behind the main counter, recording inventory in a large ledger. "Mrs. Wilson?" Abigail inquired. The woman looked up, sharp eyes taking in Abigail's appearance with the same assessing gaze that seemed common in Pine Valley. "Yes, you must be the Eastern lady Thomas Whitaker sent for." Her direct approach suggested news traveled quickly in the small community. "Abigail Harper," she confirmed, extending her hand. "Mrs. Turner suggested you might know of opportunities for a skilled seamstress in Pine Valley." Martha Wilson's expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing her initial reserve. "Not returning east, then?" "No," Abigail replied simply. "I've invested too much in coming west to retreat at the first setback." Mrs. Wilson set down her pencil. "Setback? That's a diplomatic way of putting it." She gestured to a stool beside the counter. "Sit, Miss Harper, let's speak plainly." Abigail complied, grateful for the businesslike approach. "Thomas Whitaker is the wealthiest man in Pine Valley," Mrs. Wilson began. "He's also among the most particular. You're the third mail-order bride he's sent for. The others also returned east." "I see," Abigail replied, absorbing this information. "And did they all fail to meet his physical expectations?" Mrs. Wilson's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. "One was too thin. He claimed she wouldn't survive her first winter. Another spoke with what he called an uncultivated accent. Thomas believes his Harvard education and financial success entitle him to perfection." Abigail considered this. "Then I find myself in distinguished company. Now about sewing opportunities." Mrs. Wilson nodded approvingly at her persistence. "Pine Valley has grown considerably in the past 2 years. The nearest dressmaker is in Dunstan Creek, 20 miles east. Several ladies here have mentioned the inconvenience." She hesitated. "There's a small storeroom behind the apothecary that Mr. Peterson uses mainly for storage. Might serve as a shop with some adjustment. He owes me a favor." Hope flickered in Abigail's chest. "That sounds promising. What would the rent be likely to cost?" $5 monthly, I'd estimate. Less if you're willing to do alterations for Peterson's ready-made suits." Mrs. Wilson studied Abigail with increasing interest. "Do you have a sewing machine?" "Yes. A Singer. And fabrics, patterns, notions, everything needed to establish a modest dressmaking business." "Might work, then," Mrs. Wilson concluded. "I'll speak with Peterson this afternoon." She paused, then added with unexpected kindness, "Not every man in Pine Valley shares Thomas Whitaker's narrow vision of womanhood, Miss Harper. Some value substance over form." The storeroom behind Peterson's apothecary was smaller than Abigail had hoped, barely 12 feet square, with a single window facing the narrow alley between buildings. Yet as she swept decades of dust from the plank floor and scrubbed grime from the window to admit more light, she began to envision possibilities. A cutting table could fit along the back wall, her Singer machine near the window for better light, and perhaps a small area at the front with a mirror where clients could be fitted. "It's not much," Samuel Peterson admitted as he helped her move a heavy wooden cabinet to create more space. The apothecary owner was a mild-mannered man in his 50s, with thinning hair and spectacles that continually slid down his nose. "But the rent's fair, and you'll have your own entrance from the alley." "It's perfect for my needs," Abigail assured him. "I don't require much space to begin with." Peterson nodded approvingly. "Martha Wilson speaks highly of your initiative. Not many women would choose to stay after—" He trailed off awkwardly. "After being found unsuitable as a bride," Abigail finished for him, having grown accustomed to the town's awareness of her situation. "Perhaps that's precisely why I'm staying, Mr. Peterson. To prove my value extends beyond potential matrimony." By the end of her first week in Pine Valley, Abigail had transformed the dusty storeroom into a small but functional seamstress shop. Mrs. Turner had provided an old dressing screen, which Abigail covered with floral patterned fabric to create a changing area. Mrs. Wilson contributed a slightly warped but serviceable full-length mirror, and a weathered sign now hung above the alley entrance, reading simply, A. Harper, fine. Sewing and alterations. Her first customers were predictably cautious, women who entered with transparent excuses about minor mending that could easily have been done at home. Abigail recognized their visits for what they truly were, reconnaissance missions to assess the strange Eastern woman who had defied convention by remaining in Pine Valley after Thomas Whitaker's rejection. Sarah Collins, the blacksmith's wife, brought a simple cotton dress with a torn seam. As Abigail worked, the woman's curiosity finally overcame her restraint. "You must find our little town quite different from Philadelphia," she ventured. Abigail smiled, keeping her eyes on her precise stitches. "Different, yes, but not without its charms. The mountains are more magnificent than I could have imagined from descriptions." Mrs. Collins nodded, then asked with studied casualness, "Will you be staying long in Pine Valley?" "I hope to make it my home," Abigail replied simply. "The community seems to need a seamstress, and I find I need a fresh start." Word of her skill spread quickly after she altered a ready-made suit for Michael Langley, the young schoolteacher, transforming its baggy proportions into a garment that fit his lean frame perfectly. Within 2 weeks, she had steady work, mending, alterations, and even commissions for new dresses from the more prosperous women in town. The modest income allowed her to extend her stay at the hotel, though she recognized the arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. Mrs. Turner had mentioned a small room above the dress shop that might be converted to living quarters with some work, an option Abigail was carefully considering against her dwindling savings. One particular interaction, however, reminded her that not everyone in Pine Valley welcomed her presence. Thomas Whitaker's sister, Elizabeth Carson, entered the shop one afternoon with a silk shawl that required mending. Tall and slender like her brother, with the same calculating blue eyes, she made no attempt to disguise her assessment of Abigail. "I must admit I'm surprised you chose to remain in Pine Valley, Miss Harper," she remarked, as Abigail examined the damaged silk. "Most women would find such a situation unbearably humiliating." Abigail met her gaze steadily. "Perhaps I have a different understanding of what constitutes humiliation, Mrs. Carson. I find honest work far more dignified than retreating from difficulty." Elizabeth's lips thinned. "A commendable philosophy. Though you should know that Pine Valley society is rather particular about who it embraces. My brother's position ensures that certain standards are maintained." "How fortunate that I seek customers rather than social acceptance," Abigail replied, maintaining her composure while carefully noting the loose threads in the shawl's intricate pattern. "I can have this repaired by Thursday. The charge will be 75 cents. Elizabeth left with a cryptic comment about Abigail understanding her place, which suggested the conversation had been intended as a warning rather than mere unpleasantness. That evening, Abigail mentioned the encounter to Mrs. Turner as they shared tea in the hotel kitchen after dinner. The Whitakers have considered themselves Pine Valley's first family since Thomas purchased the Crescent Ridge property 5 years ago, Mrs. Turner explained, stirring sugar into her cup. "Elizabeth married James Carson, who manages the bank. Between them, they influence most business in town." "And they're concerned about a seamstress setting up shop?" Abigail asked, puzzled by such disproportionate attention to her modest venture. Mrs. Turner's expression turned thoughtful. "It's not your business that concerns them, dear. It's the independence you represent. Thomas Whitaker rejected you, yet here you remain, building a life without his approval. That's not how their story was supposed to end." The following Sunday, Abigail attended services at Pine Valley's small church for the first time. She had delayed this public appearance, aware it would subject her to the collective scrutiny of the community. Dressed in her navy blue dress with a modest lace collar she had added herself, she slipped into a back pew just as Reverend Simmons began the opening hymn. Despite her attempt at inconspicuous entry, she felt the ripple of awareness move through the congregation. Heads turned discreetly, assessments were made, and whispers were exchanged behind gloved hands. Thomas Whitaker occupied a front pew with his sister and brother-in-law, his posture rigid as if aware of her presence, without looking back to confirm it. After the service, Abigail steeled herself for the inevitable social interaction on the church steps. Several of her customers greeted her with genuine warmth, while others maintained a polite distance, clearly mindful of the Whitaker faction observing from nearby. "Miss Harper," Reverend Simmons approached with a welcoming smile. A young man, for his position, perhaps 30, with earnest brown eyes and an open countenance. "I'm pleased you've joined our congregation. I trust you're settling well in Pine Valley?" "Very well, thank you," Abigail replied. "Everyone has been most accommodating." "Not everyone," corrected a deep voice from behind her. Abigail turned to find herself facing a tall, broad-shouldered man with copper skin and features that spoke clearly of Native American heritage, though he wore the conventional attire of a Western rancher. Denim trousers, a blue work shirt, and a well-worn leather vest. His black hair was tied back with a strip of leather, and his dark eyes held both intelligence and a hint of amusement at the discomfort his arrival was causing among the churchgoers. "John Eagle," he introduced himself, offering a hand that Abigail accepted after only a moment's hesitation. "I couldn't help overhearing your assessment of Pine Valley's hospitality." "Abigail Harper," she replied, noting how several nearby conversations had faltered at the man's arrival. "Have I misrepresented something?" John Eagle's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Only that some in our community reserve their accommodation for those they deem acceptable." His gaze drifted meaningfully toward Thomas Whitaker, who had noticeably stiffened at the exchange. Reverend Simmons cleared his throat nervously. "John is being modest about his own position here. He manages the Double Creek Ranch for the Harrington estate and serves on the town council, despite certain objections. Those certain objections being my Navajo mother and my refusal to pretend otherwise," John clarified, his tone conversational but carrying an edge of challenge. "Some believe mixed heritage should be hidden rather than honored." "An unfortunate perspective," Abigail responded, intrigued by this unexpected ally in the complex social dynamics of Pine Valley. Though not an unfamiliar one, even in Philadelphia. Their conversation was interrupted by the deliberate approach of Thomas Whitaker, his sister and brother-in-law flanking him like a formal delegation. "Miss Harper," Thomas acknowledged her with cool civility before turning his attention to John Eagle, his tone noticeably chillier. "Eagle, I don't recall seeing your name on the church membership rolls." "That's because it isn't there," John Nee replied easily. "I came to speak with Reverend Simmons about the school board meeting tomorrow. My presence at the service was incidental." Thomas's jaw tightened at the casual dismissal. "Then we won't keep you from your business." He turned to Abigail with a stiff nod. "Good day, Miss Harper." As the Whitaker party moved away, John Eagle's expression remained impassive, though a spark of humor lit his eyes. "It seems we've disrupted the natural order of Pine Valley society, Miss Harper. Thomas Whitaker doesn't know whether to be more disturbed by your refusal to disappear in shame or my existence in general." Despite herself, Abigail laughed, her first genuine laugh since arriving in Pine Valley. "Are you always so direct, Mr. Eagle?" "John," he corrected. "And yes, I find honesty saves considerable time, particularly in places where people spend so much energy maintaining illusions." He studied her with undisguised interest. "You've caused quite a stir by staying." Most of Thomas's discarded brides return east immediately. I'm not most brides, Abigail replied, and as I was never actually a bride at all, I see no reason to allow Mr. Whitaker's assessment to determine my future. The following day, Abigail received an unexpected visitor. At her shop, John Eagle appeared in the doorway just before noon, removing his hat as he entered the small space. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work, Miss Harper," he said, glancing around the modest establishment with genuine interest. "Not at all," Abigail replied, setting aside the shirt she was mending. "I was about to break for lunch." John nodded, seeming momentarily uncertain, a contrast to his confident demeanor at their first meeting. "I thought you might appreciate a proper tour of Pine Valley and its surroundings. Newcomers often see only the main street without learning what lies beyond." The invitation surprised her. "That's very kind, but won't it cause talk? Yesterday's church gathering suggested your position here is already complicated." A hint of a smile crossed his face. "My position has been complicated since the day I was born, Miss Harper. Another round of gossip won't change that." He hesitated before adding, "Besides, I find myself curious about the woman who chose to stay, despite Thomas Whitaker's rejection. It suggests an uncommon strength of character." Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks, both at the reference to her humiliation and at the unexpected compliment. "Or perhaps just stubbornness," she countered. "Very well, Mr. Eagle. John," he corrected again. "John," she acknowledged with a small smile. "I accept your offer. Allow me to close the shop." They walked the length of Pine Valley first, John pointing out establishments and sharing fragments of local history that painted a more complex picture than Abigail had gathered thus far. The town had begun as a trading post 15 years earlier, serving as a halfway point between larger settlements. Its growth had accelerated with the discovery of silver in the nearby mountains, though the boom had proved short-lived compared to other mining regions. "The Harrington family, my employers, arrived during the silver rush," John explained as they passed the imposing stone building that housed Carson's Bank. "Richard Harrington was shrewd enough to invest in cattle rather than mining claims. When the silver played out, he was positioned to become the largest landowner in the valley." "And Thomas Whitaker?" Abigail asked, unable to suppress her curiosity about the man who had so publicly rejected her. John's expression hardened slightly. "Arrived from Boston 5 years ago with Eastern money and Harvard connections. Bought Crescent Ridge when the previous owner faced foreclosure, then immediately set about reinventing himself as a frontier aristocrat." He glanced at her. "The Whitakers of Boston might be surprised to learn how Thomas portrays his distinguished family heritage out here." The implication was clear. "You're suggesting he's not what he claims to be?" John shrugged. "I'm suggesting that many who come west create new narratives for themselves, some more truthfully than others." After touring the town itself, John led her to where his horse was tethered behind the apothecary. A second horse, a gentle-looking chestnut mare, waited alongside his taller black gelding. "I took the liberty of borrowing Daisy from the livery stable," he explained, noting Abigail's hesitation. "She's the calmest mount in Pine Valley, suitable for even the most inexperienced rider." "I did ride occasionally in Philadelphia parks," Abigail admitted, "though never outside a controlled setting. Daisy will take good care of you," John assured her. "I thought you might appreciate seeing the valley from Prospect Ridge. The view explains why people choose to build lives here, despite the challenges." The prospect of riding into the countryside with a man she barely knew, particularly one whose status in the community seemed precarious, should have given Abigail pause. Yet something about John Eagle's straightforward manner inspired confidence rather than concern. His gaze held no hint of the evaluation she had come to expect from men. Instead, she found only genuine interest and a respect she hadn't experienced. Since arriving in Pine Valley, With his assistance, she mounted Daisy, arranging her skirts as modestly as possible while seated astride rather than side-saddle. John adjusted the stirrups to accommodate her shorter legs, his movements efficient and respectful of her personal space. "Ready?" he asked once she had settled. Abigail nodded, gripping the reins perhaps more tightly than necessary. "I trust Daisy. Knows what she's doing, even if I don't." John's laugh was unexpected, a warm, rich sound that transformed his serious features. "An excellent philosophy for many of life's challenges, Miss Harper." They rode at a gentle pace out of town, following a well-worn trail that wound gradually upward through stands of aspen and pine. Daisy proved as reliable as promised, responding to the slightest guidance and maintaining a smooth gait that built Abigail's confidence with each passing minute. As they climbed higher, Pine Valley spread below them in miniature, the main street. A thin line of buildings, Crescent Ridge Ranch visible to the north, and the Double Creek property extending along the valley's western edge. Beyond, the mountains rose in majestic tiers, their peaks still snow-capped despite the late spring warmth. "It's breathtaking," Abigail said softly as they reached a natural overlook where the trail widened. John dismounted and helped her down, his hands strong but gentle at her waist. "This is where my mother first brought me when I was 10 years old," he said, his voice taking on a different quality. "She wanted me to understand that there are always multiple perspectives available. That what seems small and confined from one vantage point appears vast and full of possibility from another." Abigail studied him with new interest. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," he agreed, a shadow crossing his features. "She died 3 winters ago. Influenza. I'm sorry. I lost both my parents to the same." The shared experience created an unexpected connection between them. "Were you raised in your mother's culture or your father's?" John led the horses to a small stream nearby before answering. "Both and neither. My father was a cavalry officer who resigned his commission rather than participate in campaigns against the Navajo. He met my mother during what your history books call the Long Walk, when the U.S. Army forcibly relocated the Diné to Bosque Redondo." Abigail nodded, familiar with the tragic episode. "He helped her escape?" "He escorted her group to the reservation, then returned 6 months later to marry her properly, against the wishes of both their peoples." John's expression softened with pride. "They created their own path when neither culture offered acceptance. They settled on a flat rock overlooking the valley, sharing a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried apples that John had brought in his saddlebag. The casual intimacy of the moment, so far removed from the formal courtship rituals Abigail had grown up with, felt strangely natural. "May I ask you something personal?" John ventured after they had eaten. "You may ask," Abigail replied with a smile. "I reserve the right not to answer." He acknowledged this with a nod. "Why did you agree to become a mail-order bride? You're clearly educated, capable, not the desperate type such arrangements usually attract." The question might have offended her coming from someone else, but John's genuine curiosity deserved an honest response. "My parents' deaths left me with few options in Philadelphia. The seamstress shop barely supported us when they were alive. Afterward, with rising debts." She sighed. Thomas Whitaker's letters painted a picture of intellectual companionship, mutual respect, a partnership rather than merely a convenient marriage. "And then he rejected you for your appearance," John stated flatly, no judgment in his tone. "Yes," Abigail met his gaze directly. "He found me too substantial for frontier efficiency, I believe were his words." John's expression darkened. "Thomas Whitaker's vision is severely limited in many respects." "So it seems," she agreed. "Yet his rejection forced me to consider what I truly wanted. Had he accepted me, I would have become Mrs. Whitaker of Crescent Ridge, forever defined by his position and preferences. Now, she gestured to the valley below, I have the chance to define myself. At considerable cost, John observed. Life out here isn't easy for anyone, let alone a woman alone. Abigail straightened her shoulders. I'm finding that difficulty doesn't frighten me as much as I once thought it might. Each day in Pine Valley, I discover new aspects of myself, capabilities I hadn't recognized when security was my primary concern. John studied her with undisguised admiration. The Navajo have a concept called hojo. It means beauty, harmony, balance, and right relationship with the world. My mother always said true beauty comes from living in hojo, not from how one appears to others. His gaze held hers steadily. You possess more beauty by that measure than anyone else in Pine Valley, Abigail Harper. The use of her first name, spoken with such quiet sincerity, created a warmth that spread through Abigail's chest. Before she could respond, however, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. 3 riders appeared on the trail below, Thomas Whitaker in the lead, accompanied by his brother-in-law James Carson and another man Abigail didn't recognize. They drew up sharply at the sight of John and Abigail seated together on the overlook. "Well, well," Thomas called out, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "What an interesting development. The discarded bride and the half-breed foreman seeking comfort in mutual rejection. How perfectly fitting." John rose smoothly to his feet, his relaxed posture belying the tension suddenly evident in his shoulders. "Whitaker, Carson, Mason," he acknowledged each man with a slight nod. "Enjoying the fine weather for a ride?" "We're surveying the northern boundary of my property," Thomas replied coldly. "A task that doesn't require an audience." "Public land, Whitaker," John countered. "I was showing Miss Harper the valley view." Thomas's gaze shifted to Abigail, who had also risen, smoothing her skirts as she did so. "Miss Harper seems determined to find her place in Pine Valley, despite clear indications of where she belongs." His tone made the insult unmistakable. Before John could respond, Abigail stepped forward. "Mr. Whitaker, your rejection released me from any obligation to consider your opinions about my choices or associations. I suggest we maintain a civil distance and allow each other to proceed with our separate lives." The calm dignity of her response seemed to infuriate Thomas more than any heated retort might have. His face flushed with anger. "Be careful about the company you keep, Miss Harper. Some choices have consequences that extend beyond one's personal reputation." "Is that a threat, Whitaker?" John's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Merely an observation," Thomas replied, turning his horse sharply. "Good day to you both." The 3 men rode away, but the peaceful atmosphere of the afternoon had been irreparably damaged. John helped Abigail mount Daisy without comment, his expression shuttered in a way it hadn't been before. As they descended toward Pine Valley, Abigail finally broke the uncomfortable silence. "Will there be trouble because of this encounter?" John sighed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "There's always trouble with Thomas Whitaker. The question is what form it will take." He glanced at her, genuine concern in his dark eyes. "I apologize for exposing you to additional difficulties, Abigail. That wasn't my intention." "You're not responsible for Thomas Whitaker's behavior," she replied firmly. "And I don't regret our outing, despite its unpleasant conclusion." A smile touched his lips, though his eyes remained serious. "Nor do I, but perhaps we should be more circumspect about our next meeting, for your sake if not for mine." The consequences of Abigail's outing with John Eagle materialized the very next morning. She arrived at her shop to find the door unlocked, and the interior in disarray. Fabric bolts unrolled across the floor, pattern papers scattered, and her precious Singer sewing machine knocked from its table, its delicate mechanism damaged. Nothing appeared to be stolen, making the motive clear: intimidation, not theft. Samuel Peterson found her assessing the damage, his normally mild face flushed with anger. "This is unacceptable, Miss Harper. I'll speak with Sheriff Miller immediately." "Will that help?" Abigail asked quietly, gathering torn pattern papers from the floor. The apothecary owner's hesitation answered her question. "Sheriff Miller is mindful of Pine Valley's more influential citizens." "You mean he won't cross Thomas Whitaker?" Abigail translated, setting the damaged papers on her cutting table. "It's all right, Mr. Peterson. I expected some form of retaliation after yesterday." Peterson's eyebrows rose. "You've heard the rumors, then?" "What rumors?" He shifted uncomfortably. "About you and John Eagle being seen together on Prospect Ridge. Mrs. Whitaker was at the Mercantile this morning, telling anyone who would listen that you've formed an inappropriate attachment." The implication was clear, though Abigail was surprised by how little it bothered her. "Mr. Eagle kindly offered to show me the valley from a better vantage point. We shared conversation and a simple meal. Hardly the scandal Mrs. Whitaker seems to imagine." "Pine Valley thrives on such imaginings, I'm afraid," Peterson sighed. "And John Eagle's position here has always been precarious. His competence as Double Creek's foreman is unquestionable, but his heritage makes certain people uncomfortable." "People like Thomas Whitaker," Abigail suggested, carefully righting her sewing machine to assess the damage. "Among others," Peterson confirmed, "the Harringtons value John for his work, but they spend most of their time in Denver. When they're absent, John navigates complex waters." As if summoned by their conversation, the shop's door opened to reveal John Eagle himself. His expression darkened as he took in the disrupted space and Abigail's disheveled appearance. "I heard what happened," he said grimly. "Peterson, has anyone summoned Sheriff Miller?" "I was about to," the apothecary owner replied. "Don't bother," John advised. "He'll file a report that will gather dust until everyone forgets it existed." His gaze met Abigail's. "I'm sorry. This is because of our ride yesterday. This is because Thomas Whitaker is a small man who uses his influence to intimidate those he can't control," Abigail corrected, surprising herself with the heat in her voice. "I won't give him the satisfaction of believing he succeeded." John's expression softened with admiration. "Nevertheless, I should have been more mindful of the consequences for you. Whitaker and I have history that predates your arrival." Before Abigail could inquire further, 3 women entered the shop, stopping, short at the scene before them. Sarah Collins, the blacksmith's wife, was accompanied by an elderly woman Abigail recognized from church and a young pregnant woman she hadn't met. "Oh my goodness," Mrs. Collins exclaimed, surveying the damage. "We heard something had happened, but this—" She turned to her companions. "Ladies, it seems Miss Harper could use our assistance." Without waiting for a response, the 3 women set to work, gathering scattered items, refolding fabrics, and setting the small space to rights with practiced efficiency. Abigail stood momentarily stunned by this unexpected show of support. "My grandson can fix that machine," the elderly woman announced, examining the singer with knowledgeable eyes. "He's good with mechanical things. I'm Harriet Dawson, by the way. My late husband built half the furniture in Pine Valley." "And I'm Mary Fletcher," the pregnant woman added shyly. "My husband runs the livery stable. I was hoping to commission a maternity dress, but it seems you've had trouble." "Nothing that can't be remedied," Abigail assured her, deeply touched by this spontaneous alliance. "Thank you all for your help." John Eagle had stepped back to allow the women room to work, but his presence remained a steady anchor in the chaotic space. When order had been somewhat restored, he approached Abigail again. "I came to offer more than apologies," he said quietly. "The room above your shop is hardly habitable in its current state, and the hotel is expensive. I've spoken with Matthew and Sarah Running Bear, friends who live at the edge of town. They have a small guest cabin they're willing to rent to you at a fair price." Abigail hesitated, sensing this decision might further inflame tensions with the Whittaker faction. Yet the practical considerations were compelling. Her funds were indeed dwindling, and the damaged shop would require repairs before the upstairs room could be considered. "The Running Bears are good people," Mrs. Dawson confirmed, overhearing their conversation. "Matthew is half Ute, half Scottish, runs the best trap lines in the county. Sarah makes the finest beadwork you'll ever see." She fixed John with a shrewd look. "And they're not afraid of Thomas Whittaker's disapproval, having experienced plenty of it already." This endorsement from one of Pine Valley's elder citizens settled the matter for Abigail. "I would be grateful for the introduction, John." That afternoon, John Eagle escorted Abigail to the Running Bears property at the eastern edge of town. The small homestead sat on 2 acres of cleared land backed by pine forest, with a sturdy log cabin as the main dwelling and a smaller structure nearby that had originally served as a storage shed before being converted to a guest cabin. Sarah, Running Bear, greeted them warmly, a woman perhaps 10 years older than Abigail, with striking features that reflected her Ute heritage and a quiet dignity in her movements. Unlike many native women Abigail had observed in town who wore Western clothing, Sarah's dress combined traditional elements with practical frontier adaptations. "John has spoken highly of your courage," Sarah said after introductions were made. "It is not easy to stand alone in a place where others wish you gone." "An experience you understand, I imagine," Abigail replied, sensing a kindred spirit. Sarah's smile acknowledged this shared reality. "The cabin is small but sound," she explained, leading Abigail to the guest structure. "Matthew added the stove last winter when his brother stayed with us. It keeps the space warm even in January." The cabin was indeed modest. A single room perhaps 12 feet square, with a small iron stove, a narrow bed, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a chest for storage. Yet it possessed a cozy charm, enhanced by a colorful woven rug on the plank floor and clean muslin curtains at the single window. "It's perfect," Abigail declared, immediately drawn to the simple space's honest functionality. "What would be a fair rent?" $3 monthly, Sarah replied. "And perhaps some sewing in trade occasionally. My skills with needle and thread are limited to necessity rather than beauty." The arrangement was quickly settled, with Abigail to take possession the following day. As she and John prepared to depart, Matthew Running Bear returned from checking his trap lines, a tall, powerfully built man whose Scottish heritage was evident in his reddish beard, though his features and coloring otherwise reflected his Ute. Father, so you're the woman who's upset Thomas Whittaker's carefully arranged world," he observed after Sarah made introductions. "Good. That man's had things his own way for too long. I'm not intentionally antagonizing Mr. Whittaker," Abigail clarified. "I simply refused to disappear because he found me unsuitable." "Intention matters less than effect," Matthew replied with a chuckle, "and the effect of your presence has been to reveal Whittaker's true character to those who were willing to overlook it while it didn't affect them." John had remained silent during this exchange, but now he stepped forward. "Matthew, someone vandalized Miss Harper's shop last night. Nothing was stolen, but her sewing machine was damaged." The trapper's expression hardened. "Whittaker's doing?" "No, and proof," John admitted. "But the timing suggests retaliation for our outing yesterday." Matthew considered this. "My brother works at the sawmill. I'll have him keep his ears open. Mill workers drink at the Broken Spoke, not the Cattlemen's Club, where Whittaker holds court. Different gossip, different loyalties." As they rode back toward town, Abigail found herself contemplating the unexpected allies she had discovered in a single day. From the women who had helped restore her shop to the Running Bears who had offered her shelter. The frontier community contained more complexity than she had initially perceived, with factions and alliances that didn't always align with obvious social boundaries. "You're quiet," John observed as they approached the outskirts of Pine Valley. "I'm reconsidering my understanding of this place," Abigail admitted. "When I arrived, it seemed Pine Valley was Thomas Whitaker's domain entirely. Now I see there are many who quietly resist his influence." John nodded. "Frontier communities often contain contradictions. The same isolation that can breed prejudice also fosters independence. Those who've carved lives from wilderness tend to judge others by their actions rather than society's dictates." He glanced at her with a hint of amusement. "Though you're testing even that frontier pragmatism by being both Eastern and determined to stay despite Whitaker's rejection. And by associating with you," Abigail added perceptively. "That too," he acknowledged. "Though I suspect the vandalism is more about undermining your independence than punishing your choice of company. Thomas Whitaker fears self-sufficient women even more than he disdains mixed heritage." They parted at the edge of town, John conscious of the damage further public association might cause to Abigail's already compromised standing. As she walked the remaining distance to the hotel, Abigail found herself reflecting on the strange turn her life had taken. She had journeyed west seeking security through marriage, only to find herself embarking on a path of independence that would have been unimaginable in Philadelphia. More surprising still was her growing attachment to John Eagle, a man whose heritage placed him outside the social boundaries she had been raised to respect, yet whose integrity and intelligence increasingly drew her admiration. Their connection, still tentative but undeniably forming, represented yet another departure from the future she had envisioned when boarding the train east. That evening, as she packed her belongings in preparation for the move to the running Bears' cabin, Mrs. Turner knocked at her door with an unexpected message. "This came for you," the hotel proprietress said, handing Abigail a small envelope. "Messenger boy brought it just now." Inside, Abigail found a brief note in an elegant feminine hand. "Miss Harper, I understand your shop was vandalized. While I cannot publicly oppose my brother's actions, I find them increasingly disturbing. If you would meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the church, I may have information that could prove useful to you." With discretion, Elizabeth Carson Abigail stared at the note in confusion. Thomas Whitaker's sister, who had previously delivered thinly veiled warnings about Abigail's place in Pine Valley society, now sought a clandestine meeting. Was it a genuine offer of alliance from an unexpected quarter, or a more sophisticated trap than the vandalism of her shop? Either way, Abigail realized, Pine Valley had become a battlefield where she now stood at the center of forces beyond her control. Yet, with every challenge, her determination to forge her own path only strengthened. The Pine Valley Church stood empty and silent when Abigail arrived for her mysterious meeting with Elizabeth Carson. Dust motes danced in sunlight streaming through plain glass windows, illuminating the simple wooden pews and unadorned altar. After the vandalism of her shop, Abigail had debated whether to keep this appointment, finally deciding that understanding her adversaries might prove as valuable as knowing her allies. She had moved her belongings to the Running Bear's cabin that morning, grateful for Matthew's offer to transport her trunks in his wagon. The small space already felt more like home than her hotel room had, perhaps because it represented a deliberate choice rather than a temporary arrangement. Abigail settled into a back pew to wait, alert for any sign that this meeting might be a pretext for further harassment. Minutes ticked by with no sign of Elizabeth Carson. Just as Abigail began to wonder if the note had been merely a cruel jest, the side door opened to admit Thomas Whitaker's sister. Elizabeth looked markedly different from their previous encounters. Gone was the immaculate, fashionable appearance that had intimidated Abigail at their first meeting. Instead, Elizabeth's face appeared drawn, with shadows beneath her eyes suggesting sleepless nights, and her typically perfect coiffure showed signs of hasty arrangement. "You came," Elizabeth said, sounding genuinely surprised as she slipped into the pew beside Abigail. "I wasn't certain you would, after what happened to your shop." "Curiosity can be a powerful motivator," Abigail replied cautiously. "Your note suggested you have information that might interest me." Elizabeth glanced nervously toward the church doors before responding. "First, I want to make clear that I had no knowledge of the vandalism before it occurred. My brother's methods have become increasingly concerning to me. Why would Thomas Whitaker's methods concern his most loyal supporter?" Abigail asked, recalling Elizabeth's previous warnings about Pine Valley's social hierarchy. "Because I've begun to recognize patterns I can no longer ignore," Elizabeth replied, tension evident in her posture. "You're not the first woman Thomas has brought to Pine Valley with promises of marriage, only to reject upon arrival." This confirmed what Martha Wilson had mentioned, but Elizabeth's intimate connection to Thomas suggested she possessed deeper insights. "Mrs. Wilson indicated there were others before me." "3 others," Elizabeth clarified, "all educated, Eastern women who corresponded with Thomas for months before journeying west. All rejected for supposed physical imperfections upon arrival, all encouraged to return east immediately. Yet I chose to stay," Abigail noted. "Why does that provoke such extreme reactions from your brother?" Elizabeth's fingers twisted nervously in her lap. "Because you've disrupted his carefully constructed narrative. The previous women left immediately, their humiliation complete and private. Your decision to remain in Pine Valley forces the community to confront Thomas's behavior directly." Abigail considered this. "That explains his hostility toward me, but not your sudden desire to provide information. What's changed, Mrs. Carson?" A flicker of genuine distress crossed Elizabeth's features. "My brother's fixation on controlling Pine Valley's social structure has always been intense. But since your arrival and decision to stay, he's become increasingly erratic. The vandalism of your shop crossed a line I cannot condone. And your husband? Does James Carson share your concerns?" Elizabeth's bitter laugh held no humor. "James follows Thomas's lead in all things, their financial entanglements. Ensure his compliance." Abigail sensed there was more beneath Elizabeth's carefully measured words. "Mrs. Carson, I appreciate your disavowal of the vandalism, but I doubt you arranged this meeting merely to distance yourself from your brother's actions." Elizabeth drew a deep breath, visibly steeling herself. "No, I came to warn you." She lowered her voice further. "Thomas has learned of your arrangement with the Running Bears. He views your association with John Eagle and now the Running Bear family as further defiance, a deliberate challenge to his authority." "By residing in a cabin I'm renting fairly?" Abigail asked incredulously. "By aligning yourself with the very elements of Pine Valley society Thomas has worked to marginalize," Elizabeth clarified. "The Running Bears, John Eagle, anyone of mixed heritage who refuses to accept subordinate status threatens the racial hierarchy Thomas believes essential to proper society." "And what does Thomas intend to do about my living arrangements?" Abigail asked directly. Elizabeth hesitated. "I overheard him speaking with James and Edward Mason about ensuring the Running Bears understand the consequences of harboring troublemakers. I fear he may be planning something more direct than vandalism." The implication sent a chill through Abigail. "He would threaten the Running Bears' property?" "My brother believes himself untouchable in Pine Valley," Elizabeth replied grimly. "Sheriff Miller won't act against him, and most merchants depend on Thomas's goodwill for their livelihoods." "Why are you telling me this?" Abigail studied Elizabeth's face, searching for hidden motives. "Your position in Pine Valley depends entirely on your brother's status." Something in Elizabeth's expression shifted. vulnerability briefly replacing her usual careful reserve. "Because I've begun to recognize what my alliance with Thomas has cost me. The previous bride he rejected, the one before you, was a woman named Catherine Bennett. She was intelligent, kind, and yes, somewhat plain by conventional standards. I watched Thomas destroy her with calculated cruelty, and I said nothing." Her voice faltered. "I've carried that silence like a stone in my chest ever since." Abigail absorbed this confession, trying to reconcile the proud, dismissive woman who had first entered her shop with this conflicted figure now seeking some form of redemption. "What would you have me do with this warning?" "Be vigilant," Elizabeth replied. "Perhaps inform John Eagle, who has more allies in town than Thomas realizes." She rose to leave, then hesitated. "And Miss Harper? I know we can never be friends, but I hope you understand that not everyone in the Whittaker circle celebrates Thomas's methods, even if we've lacked the courage to oppose them openly." After Elizabeth departed through the side door, Abigail remained in the church, contemplating this unexpected development. The revelation that Thomas Whittaker had systematically rejected multiple mail-order brides suggested a disturbing pattern beyond mere selectiveness. What satisfaction did he derive from luring women across the continent only to humiliate and dismiss them? And why had this pattern gone unchallenged by Pine Valley's citizens? More immediately concerning was the threat to the running bears, whose only transgression had been offering Abigail fair lodging. She needed to warn them, and quickly. Leaving the church, Abigail walked briskly toward her shop, intending to complete essential repairs before heading to the Running Bears homestead. To her surprise, she found John Eagle inside, carefully reassembling, her Singer sewing machine alongside an elderly man with gnarled hands and sharp eyes. "Mr. Dawson was kind enough to examine your machine," John explained, looking up at her entrance. "He believes the damage is repairable." "The timing mechanism is bent, but not broken," the old man confirmed without preamble. "I've seen worse from normal use. Should be working by tomorrow." "Thank you, Mr. Dawson. Your assistance is truly appreciated," Abigail said warmly. The elderly craftsman nodded in acknowledgement before gathering his tools. "Never did like bullies," he muttered as he departed, leaving Abigail alone with John. "You seem troubled," John observed once the door closed behind Mr. Dawson. "Did something happen?" Abigail hesitated, uncertain how much of Elizabeth's warning to share. "I received information suggesting Thomas Whittaker may extend his harassment to the Running Bears for agreeing to rent me the cabin." John's expression darkened. "From a reliable source." "Elizabeth Carson," Abigail admitted. "She approached me privately, seemingly troubled by her brother's escalating behavior." Surprise flickered across John's features. "Elizabeth has always been Thomas's staunchest defender. What prompted this change of heart?" "Apparently I'm not. The first mail-order bride Thomas has rejected," Abigail explained. "Elizabeth appears to be developing reservations about her brother's pattern of behavior." John absorbed this information thoughtfully. Interesting. Though whether Elizabeth's concern extends beyond private warnings to actual opposition remains to be seen. He set down the screwdriver he had been using on the sewing machine. "What specifically did she say about the Running Bears?" Abigail relayed Elizabeth's warning about consequences for harboring troublemakers, noting the involvement of James Carson and Edward Mason in the conversation she had overheard. "Mason owns the largest freight company servicing Pine Valley," John explained, his concern evident. "He controls most supply deliveries to local businesses. Between Mason's shipping influence, Carson's banking leverage, and Whittaker's social authority, they could make life very difficult for the Running Bears." "I won't allow them to suffer for helping me," Abigail declared. "Perhaps I should find alternative lodging." "That would only confirm Whittaker's belief that intimidation works," John countered. Besides, Matthew Running Bear isn't easily frightened. He faced down a grizzly with nothing but a hunting knife 2 springs ago. Thomas Whitaker hardly compares. Despite John's attempt at levity, Abigail recognized the genuine concern beneath his casual manner. "What do you suggest?" John considered the question carefully. "First, we warn Matthew and Sarah so they're prepared for whatever Whitaker might attempt. Second, we expand your base of support in Pine Valley." A spark of inspiration lit his eyes. "The Harvest Dance is this Saturday at the town hall. Every family in the valley attends. It's tradition. Your presence there, moving comfortably among the townspeople rather than isolating yourself, would demonstrate that Whitaker's attempts to ostracize you have failed." "Would my attendance be welcome?" Abigail asked doubtfully. "I'm hardly established in the community. Harriet Dawson is organizing the event, and she clearly supports you," John pointed out, "as do Sarah Collins and several other women who helped restore your shop. Their husbands will follow their lead in social matters." Abigail considered the suggestion. Public participation in a community event would indeed signal her intention to establish herself permanently in Pine Valley, regardless of Thomas Whitaker's opposition. Yet the prospect of navigating the complex social currents of a frontier celebration, particularly as an object of curiosity and controversy, was daunting. "Would you attend as well?" she asked John. A shadow crossed his features. "I usually make an appearance. The Harringtons expect Double Creek to be represented." He hesitated before adding, "though I typically don't remain long. Not everyone appreciates my presence at social gatherings." The implication was clear. John Eagle occupied a precarious position in Pine Valley, respected for his competence and the authority delegated to him by the absent Harringtons, yet never fully accepted by those who viewed his Navajo heritage as an insurmountable barrier to social equality. "Perhaps we could attend together," Abigail suggested impulsively. "After all, if I'm to be ostracized for my associations, I might as well earn the distinction properly." John's expression transformed with surprise, followed by something warmer that made Abigail's pulse quicken. "You understand, that would be interpreted as a deliberate stance against Whitaker and his allies?" "I believe that boundary was crossed when we shared a picnic on Prospect Ridge," Abigail replied, surprising herself with her boldness. "Unless you're concerned about being seen with the woman Thomas Whitaker deemed too substantial for frontier efficiency." For a moment, John simply looked at her, his dark eyes filled with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then he smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed his serious features. "Miss Harper," he said softly, "I would be honored to escort you to the Harvest Dance, whatever consequences may follow." Word of Abigail's planned attendance at the Harvest Dance, accompanied by John Eagle no less, spread through Pine Valley with remarkable speed. In the days leading up to the event, Abigail noticed a distinct shift in how townspeople greeted her. Some, particularly those connected to the Whitaker faction, now avoided eye contact entirely. Others, previously cautious in their interactions, offered more open expressions of support, as if her bold stance had given them permission to reveal their own misgivings about Thomas Whitaker's influence. "You've become a symbol," Sarah Running Bear observed, as she helped Abigail modify one of her dresses for the dance. "Those who resent Whitaker's control but feared standing alone now see a path for resistance." They sat in the Running Bear's main cabin, where Sarah had invited Abigail for the afternoon. The native woman's skilled fingers worked intricate beadwork onto the bodice of Abigail's best green dress, transforming the simple Eastern garment with patterns that subtly incorporated both Western and traditional designs. "I never intended to challenge anyone's authority," Abigail replied, watching with admiration as Sarah added another perfect row of tiny beads. "I simply wished to establish myself independently after Mr. Whitaker's rejection." Sarah's knowing Smile suggested she understood more than Abigail had articulated. Independence itself is the challenge. Pine Valley operates on carefully maintained dependencies. Merchants depend on Whitaker's business, farmers on Carson's loans, everyone on Mason's freight deliveries. Your seamstress shop creates a small but significant disruption to that system. Abigail considered this perspective. And John, where does he fit in this complex balance? Sarah set her beadwork aside, studying Abigail with sudden intensity. John Eagle walks between worlds, belonging fully to neither. The Harringtons value him enough to place Double Creek under his management, which grants him authority that makes some uncomfortable. Yet he remains excluded from the inner circles of Pine Valley society. She hesitated before adding, "His friendship with you has not gone unnoticed by either side of that divide." "Is it merely friendship?" Abigail asked softly, voicing the question that had occupied her thoughts with increasing frequency. "That is for you and John to determine," Sarah replied diplomatically. "But understand that any deeper attachment would carry consequences beyond the typical challenges of courtship. Are you prepared for what loving a man of mixed heritage might mean, especially given your already precarious position here?" The question wasn't accusatory, but practical, the same clear-eyed assessment Sarah applied to all aspects of frontier life. Before Abigail could formulate a response, Matthew Running Bear entered the cabin, his expression unusually grave. "We have visitors," he announced. "Edward Mason and two men I don't recognize. They're asking to speak with you, Abigail." Sarah immediately set aside her beadwork, her posture straightening. "Where are they?" "Waiting by the property line," Matthew replied. "I told them I'd need to check if you were receiving visitors." Abigail felt a flutter of apprehension. Elizabeth, Carson's warning about consequences for the Running Bears suddenly seemed very immediate. "I should speak with them," she decided. "This is likely connected to Thomas Whitaker's displeasure with my living arrangements." "We'll join you," Matthew stated firmly. "This is our property after all." Edward Mason waited beside a handsome buggy flanked by two men, whose appearance suggested hired muscle rather than business associates. Mason himself was a thin, fastidious man in his 40s, dressed in the finest clothes Pine Valley's limited options could provide. His perpetually pinched expression suggested chronic dissatisfaction with his surroundings. "Miss Harper," he greeted Abigail with cold formality, "I've come on behalf of concerned citizens regarding your current accommodation situation." "Mr. Mason," Abigail returned evenly, "I wasn't aware my housing arrangements required community approval." Mason's lips thinned at her directness. "Pine Valley maintains certain standards for residential arrangements, particularly for unmarried women of respectable background." "Fascinating," Matthew Running Bear interjected. "I don't recall such standards being applied to the miners who rent rooms above the saloon, or the unmarried ranch hands who bunk six to a cabin at Crescent Ridge." Mason pointedly ignored Matthew, keeping his attention fixed on Abigail. "Missy Harper, out of concern for your reputation and safety, I've been authorized to offer you alternative lodging, a small but proper cottage on Whitaker property at reduced rent. This would provide you the independence you seem to value, while ensuring you remain within the protective sphere of established society." The offer's true nature was transparent, a means to separate Abigail from her growing circle of allies and place her under Whitaker's direct influence. "That's very considerate, Mr. Mason, but I'm quite satisfied with my current arrangements." "I urge you to reconsider," Mason pressed, a harder edge entering his voice. "Should you persist in this unsuitable living situation, certain business consequences might naturally follow. My company controls most freight deliveries to Pine Valley merchants, including fabric shipments. It would be unfortunate if your orders were to experience delays." Are you threatening to interfere with my business because you disapprove of where I live? Abigail asked directly, anger overcoming her initial apprehension. Simply outlining potential consequences of your choices, Mason replied smoothly. Additionally, I understand you've accepted John Eagle's escort to the harvest dance. Another decision you might wish to reconsider. Matthew Running Bear stepped forward, his imposing physical presence causing Mason's hired men to shift nervously. I believe you've delivered your message, Mason. Miss Harper has declined your generous offer. Now, I'll ask you to leave our property. For a tense moment, it seemed Mason might escalate the confrontation. Instead, he offered a tight smile. Consider carefully, Miss Harper. There's still time to make the sensible choice. With that, he and his men returned to their buggy and departed. That went about as expected, Matthew observed grimly once they were alone. I've caused you trouble, Abigail said, distress evident in her voice. Perhaps I should accept their offer to prevent retaliation against you and Sarah. Absolutely not, Sarah stated firmly. The moment you concede to such tactics, you lose any hope of true independence in Pine Valley. Matthew nodded agreement. Besides, Mason's threats have limitations. I don't sell to Pine Valley merchants. My furs go directly to Denver buyers, and Sarah's beadwork is commissioned by collectors who don't care about local politics. They can make things uncomfortable, but not impossible. Despite their reassurances, Abigail spent a restless night contemplating the escalating stakes. What had begun as a personal recovery from humiliation had somehow transformed into a broader challenge to Pine Valley's social order. By rejecting Mason's offer, she had effectively declined to be reabsorbed into Thomas Whitaker's sphere of influence on his terms. The harvest dance would now represent a public declaration of her allegiance in this increasingly divided community. Saturday evening arrived with a crisp autumn chill that hinted at the approaching winter. Abigail dressed carefully in her green gown, now beautifully embellished with Sarah Running Bear's subtle beadwork. The design incorporated traditional Ute patterns that Sarah had explained, represented strength and renewal, concepts Abigail found powerfully appropriate to her circumstances. As she secured her mother's cameo at her throat, a soft knock announced John Eagle's arrival. Sarah Running Bear had insisted on receiving him properly in their main cabin rather than having him collect Abigail directly from the guest quarters, a formality that honored both John's position and the significance of the evening. John's appearance momentarily stole Abigail's breath. Gone was the practical ranch foreman's attire she had grown accustomed to. Instead, he wore a well-tailored black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and commanding height. His hair was tied back neatly, and his only concession to his Navajo heritage was a simple silver concho tie fastening at his throat. His expression as he beheld Abigail created a warmth that spread from her chest to her fingertips. "You look beautiful," he said simply, the sincerity in his voice making the conventional compliment feel deeply personal. "Sarah's handiwork deserves the credit," Abigail replied, gesturing to the beaded embellishments. "No," John disagreed quietly. "Sarah's artistry merely highlights what was already there." Matthew Running Bear cleared his throat with exaggerated emphasis. "If you two have finished admiring each other, we should depart. Traditional for everyone to arrive at the harvest dance by sunset." They traveled to town in Matthew's wagon, the Running Bear's presence providing a buffer against the more obvious forms of hostility they might face. As they approached the town hall, normally a multi-purpose building that served for community meetings, court sessions, and occasional church overflows, Abigail could see lanterns illuminating the structure and hear fiddle music spilling into the evening air. "Remember," Sarah advised as they drew closer, "many will watch to see if you appear uncomfortable or ashamed. Your confidence matters more than any words tonight." Abigail nodded, drawing a steadying breath as John helped her down from the wagon. His warm hand remained at the small of her back as they approached the entrance, a subtle gesture of support that gave her courage to lift her chin and smile as they stepped inside. The town hall had been transformed with autumn decorations. Dried corn husks, pumpkins, and paper lanterns, creating a warm, festive atmosphere. Nearly every family in Pine Valley appeared to be present, from wealthy ranchers to modest shopkeepers, creating a surprisingly democratic gathering where social divisions momentarily relaxed in celebration of the harvest season. A palpable ripple of awareness spread through the crowd as Abigail and John entered, conversations faltering before resuming with increased intensity. From across the room, Abigail caught sight of Thomas Whitaker, his face darkening as he registered their arrival together. Beside him, Elizabeth Carson's expression revealed nothing, though Abigail thought she detected a flicker of something. Approval, perhaps, before the woman's careful mask of indifference returned. "Well," John murmured close to her ear, "it appears we've already accomplished our goal of being noticed." "For better or worse," Abigail agreed, surprised to find her anxiety fading in the face of actual confrontation. After weeks of isolation and uncertainty following Thomas's rejection, there was something oddly liberating about standing openly among the people of Pine Valley with John Eagle at her side. Harriet Dawson approached them first, her aged face creased in a welcoming smile. "Miss Harper, Mr. Eagle, how lovely to see you both. The dance is just beginning. I do hope you'll participate." This public greeting from one of Pine Valley's respected elders served as a signal to others who might have hesitated to acknowledge them. Soon, Sarah Collins and her blacksmith husband joined them, followed by Samuel Peterson and his wife, and even Reverend Simmons, who expressed genuine pleasure at Abigail's integration into community life. "See," John whispered, as they accepted cups of apple cider from a refreshment table. "Whitaker's influence has limits. Many here have quietly resented his control for years. Or perhaps they simply appreciate a new source of gossip," Abigail suggested wryly. John laughed, the sound drawing curious glances from nearby dancers. "A cynic already. Pine Valley is affecting you, Miss Harper." As the evening progressed, Abigail found herself surprised by the genuine warmth extended by many community members. Several women inquired about commissioning dresses, apparently untroubled by Thomas Whitaker's disapproval. The schoolteacher, Michael Langley, whose suit she had altered, introduced her to his fiancé with effusive praise for Abigail's skills. Even Sheriff Miller, though clearly uncomfortable defying Whitaker openly, offered a polite greeting. When the fiddlers struck up a lively reel and John extended his hand in invitation, Abigail hesitated only briefly before accepting. They joined the dance floor among a dozen other couples, their movements initially awkward as they negotiated the steps together, then increasingly fluid as they found their rhythm. "You dance well for a man who claims to avoid social gatherings," Abigail observed, breathless from the vigorous pace. "My father insisted I learn," John replied, as they circled each other. He believed mastering both cultures' social customs was essential for navigating the world he foresaw, one where the boundaries between native and white societies would increasingly blur. "A wise man," Abigail commented, as the dance brought them together again, his hand warm against hers. "Yes," John agreed, his dark eyes holding hers. "Though I doubt even he imagined I would one day dance with a Philadelphia seamstress who defies frontier conventions as thoroughly as you do, Abigail Harper." As the evening progressed, the initially cautious atmosphere at the harvest dance warmed considerably. More townspeople approached Abigail and John, some offering genuine conversation, while others simply satisfied their curiosity about the unlikely pair causing such a stir in Pine Valley's social order. The music shifted to a slower waltz, and John guided Abigail onto the floor once more. His hand at her waist felt natural now, their movements together having found an easy harmony that belied their short acquaintance. "I believe we've survived the worst of the scrutiny," John observed quietly as they circled the floor. "No public denunciations or dramatic exits. The night is still young," Abigail replied with a small smile. "Thomas Whitaker has yet to make his move." As if summoned by her words, the crowd parted to reveal Thomas approaching, his expression coldly determined. Elizabeth followed a few steps behind, her face tense with apprehension. "Miss Harper," Thomas called out, his voice pitched to Carrie, across the room. "I believe this dance belongs to me." The fiddlers faltered momentarily before continuing their melody, though conversations throughout the hall died away as people turned to observe the confrontation everyone had anticipated. John's hand tightened almost imperceptibly at Abigail's waist before he stepped back with deliberate calm. "The lady's choice, Whitaker." All eyes turned to Abigail, whose heart raced despite her outwardly composed demeanor. To refuse Thomas publicly would escalate the situation further, yet accepting his invitation felt like a betrayal of both herself and John. "One dance, Mr. Whitaker," she agreed finally, accepting his extended hand. "Though I'm surprised by your interest, given your previous assessment of my suitability." Thomas led her stiffly into the waltz, his movements technically correct but devoid of the natural rhythm she had experienced with John. "You misunderstand my purpose," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "This isn't interest. It's an opportunity for you to reconsider your increasingly problematic choices." "How thoughtful," Abigail replied, maintaining her composure despite his insulting clarification. "Though I wasn't aware my choices required your approval." "In Pine Valley, certain standards must be maintained," Thomas insisted, his fingers tightening uncomfortably around hers. "Your association with John Eagle demeans you and disrupts the natural order of our community." Abigail met his gaze directly. "The natural order you've constructed, Mr. Whitaker? I find it curious that a man who rejected me for my appearance now concerns himself so deeply with my social standing." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Your appearance made you unsuitable as my wife. Your behavior now makes you dangerous to Pine Valley's stability." "Dangerous," Abigail repeated, genuinely surprised by his choice of words. "For befriending people you deem beneath your notice. For undermining necessary distinctions," Thomas hissed. "If women like you can establish themselves independently, if men like Eagle can move freely in society alongside their betters, what becomes of the hierarchy that civilization requires?" In that moment, Abigail understood with perfect clarity the true nature of Thomas Whitaker's fixation. His rejection of multiple mail-order brides hadn't been about their physical shortcomings at all. It had been about power. He had lured women west with promises of partnership, only to dismiss them upon arrival, demonstrating his absolute control over their fates. Her refusal to accept his judgment and depart in shame had challenged that control in ways that threatened his carefully constructed identity. "Perhaps," she suggested calmly, "civilization might actually benefit from judging people by their character, rather than arbitrary distinctions of appearance or heritage." "Naive Eastern sentimentality," Thomas dismissed. "The frontier requires order, discipline, clear boundaries. Is that why you reject every bride who answers your advertisements?" Abigail asked directly. "To maintain these boundaries you're so concerned about?" Thomas missed a step, his composure slipping momentarily. "My personal decisions are not your concern." "They became my concern when you humiliated me," Abigail countered. "What satisfaction do you derive from luring women across the continent only to reject them, Mr. Whitaker? Do you enjoy the power of building hopes you intend to destroy?" His eyes narrowed dangerously. "This conversation is over. You've been offered accommodation under my protection and chosen instead to align yourself with social inferiors. The consequences of that decision will become increasingly apparent." The music ended, and Thomas released her abruptly. "You have one more opportunity to reconsider, Miss Harper. Announce now that you'll accept the cottage on my property and discontinue your association with Eagle. Otherwise, I cannot guarantee your continued welcome in Pine Valley." The surrounding dancers had moved back slightly, creating a small clearing where Abigail and Thomas stood facing each other. Though their conversation had been private, the tension between them was palpable enough that nearby onlookers watched with undisguised interest. Abigail was acutely aware of John Eagle standing a few yards away, his expression carefully neutral, despite the obvious confrontation. Beyond him, she could see the running bears, Samuel Peterson, Harriet Dawson, people who had shown her kindness and support despite the risk to their own positions in the community. "Mr. Whitaker," she began, her voice steady and clear enough to reach those nearest them, "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I must decline your offer. My current arrangements suit me perfectly." Thomas's face hardened. "Then you leave. Me no choice but to make certain accommodations of my own." He turned to address James Carson and Edward Mason, who had moved to his side. "Gentlemen, it seems we must implement those measures we discussed regarding undesirable influences in Pine Valley." "Thomas," Elizabeth Carson stepped forward, her voice tight with uncharacteristic emotion, "this has gone far enough. Your vendetta against Miss Harper has become embarrassingly transparent." Her public contradiction of her brother created a ripple of shock through the observing crowd. Thomas himself appeared momentarily stunned before his expression darkened further. "Elizabeth, you forget yourself," he warned. "This is hardly the venue for family disagreements." "On the contrary," Elizabeth replied, her voice gaining strength, "this is precisely the venue to address how you've manipulated this community's social structure for your personal gratification." She turned to address the assembled townspeople directly. "My brother has systematically lured educated women to Pine Valley with promises of marriage, only to reject each upon arrival for invented imperfections." "Elizabeth!" Thomas snapped, grabbing her arm. "You will cease this immediately." John Eagle moved forward, his presence imposing despite his calm demeanor. "Remove your hand from Mrs. Carson, Whitaker. She's speaking freely, as is her right." "The right to spread slander?" Thomas retorted, though he released his sister's arm. "The right to speak truth," Elizabeth countered. "Catherine Bennett, Rebecca Williams, Margaret Foster, all women you corresponded with for months, convincing each she would find a respectful partnership in Pine Valley. All rejected immediately upon arrival for minor physical characteristics you could have easily discerned from their photographs or correspondence." Murmurs spread through the crowd as Elizabeth continued, her composed facade finally cracking to reveal genuine distress. "I remained silent through 3 such incidents, watching these women depart in humiliation rather than face the community that had witnessed their rejection. But Miss Harper's courage in remaining forced me to confront the pattern of cruelty I've enabled through my silence." Thomas's face had gone dangerously pale. "You understand nothing of my reasons," he said tightly. "I understand enough," Elizabeth replied. "You never intended to marry any of these women. You simply enjoyed demonstrating your power to accept or reject, to build expectations you planned to destroy from the beginning." The hall had grown utterly silent as this family drama unfolded before the assembled community. Abigail stood motionless, as stunned as everyone else by Elizabeth's unexpected public stand. "It's worse than that," came a voice from the crowd. Mary Fletcher, the pregnant woman who had commissioned a maternity dress from Abigail, stepped forward. 2 years ago, before I met my husband, I worked as a housekeeper at Crescent Ridge. I overheard Mr. Whitaker and Mr. Carson discussing the mail-order bride scheme, as they called it. Mr. Whitaker boasted that bringing educated women to Pine Valley only to reject them demonstrated his superior discernment to the community. She looked at Thomas with undisguised contempt. He called it entertaining to watch their hopes collapse. A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. Several of Pine Valley's leading citizens, men who had previously deferred to Thomas in all things, exchanged troubled glances. Reverend Simmons stepped forward, his young face grave with disappointment. "Mr. Whitaker, is this true? Have you deliberately brought women here under false pretenses?" Thomas Whitaker looked around the hall, suddenly aware that his carefully cultivated authority had crumbled before him. His gaze swept over faces that had once regarded him with deference, but now showed everything from open disgust to uncomfortable uncertainty. "You cannot possibly understand the necessity of maintaining certain standards," he began, his voice losing its usual commanding tone. "These women, their expectations, their presumptions of equality, would have undermined everything I've built here." "What exactly have you built, Thomas?" Sheriff Miller asked quietly from nearby. The law officer had remained largely neutral in the growing tensions, but now he stood straighter, his weathered face showing a resolve that had been notably absent in previous confrontations. "A community based on fear and false hierarchy? That's not civilization, that's tyranny on a small scale." John Eagle stepped to Abigail's side, his quiet presence offering stability amid the escalating tension. "I believe," he said calmly, "that the true nature of beauty has been revealed tonight, though not in the way anyone anticipated." His words, spoken with quiet dignity, drew attention from the Whitaker confrontation to where he stood beside Abigail. In that moment, with John's steady presence beside her and the community witnessing Thomas's exposure, Abigail felt a profound sense of vindication. She had journeyed west seeking a new beginning through marriage, only to discover her own strength through rejection. Thomas Whitaker looked around the hall once more, his expression shifting from indignation to the dawning realization that his position was irreparably damaged. Without another word, he turned and strode from the building, James Carson following hastily behind him. Edward Mason hesitated, clearly calculating whether to join their retreat or distance himself from the scandal, before reluctantly following. In the silence that followed their departure, Matthew Running Bear stepped forward. "I believe we came here for a celebration," he announced pragmatically. "Fiddlers, if you please." As the music tentatively resumed, Elizabeth approached Abigail, her composure somewhat restored, though her hands trembled visibly. "I apologize for my delay in speaking the truth, Miss Harper. Fear of losing my position in a community where women have few independent options kept me complicit far too long." "What will you do now?" Abigail asked, genuinely concerned for the woman who had finally chosen principle over security. "Begin again," Elizabeth replied with quiet determination. "My husband will undoubtedly side with Thomas as their financial entanglements run deep, but I've made my own arrangements." She glanced toward Harriet Dawson, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Dawson has offered me temporary accommodation while I establish my independence." John Eagle, who had remained respectfully silent during this exchange, now offered his arm to Abigail. "The waltz is beginning again, Miss Harper. Shall we continue where we were interrupted?" As they moved together across the floor, Abigail felt the weight of the past months, the humiliation of rejection, the struggle to establish herself, the tension of opposing Thomas Whitaker's influence, begin to lift. The path forward would not be easy, but she no longer faced it alone. "You never saw me as Thomas did," she said softly as they danced. "From our first meeting, you looked beyond appearance to something deeper." John's dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her heart quicken. "The Diné understand that true beauty, Hoju, emanates from within, from harmony with oneself and the world. Your courage in facing rejection, your determination to create your own path instead of retreating, these reveal your true nature far more clearly than any physical attribute. As the music swelled around them, John drew her slightly closer than proper dance forms strictly permitted. In you, Abigail Harper, I see a beauty that Thomas Whitaker could never comprehend, one that grows more evident with each challenge you overcome. The weeks following the harvest dance brought remarkable changes to Pine Valley. Thomas Whitaker's influence diminished rapidly as stories of his manipulative mail-order bride scheme spread throughout the county. James Carson maintained his position at the bank, but his authority was considerably weakened, forcing him to conduct business with greater transparency than before. Edward Mason, ever the pragmatist, quickly distanced himself from his former allies. When Abigail's next fabric shipment arrived not only on time, but with an unexpected discount, she recognized it as Mason's attempt to realign himself with the changing social current. Most surprising was Sheriff Miller's transformation. Having allowed Thomas Whitaker's intimidation tactics to proceed unchallenged for years, he now seemed determined to establish a more even-handed approach to law enforcement. When a drunken ranch hand made disparaging remarks about Abigail and John's growing relationship, Miller personally escorted the man to the town limits with a warning about respecting all Pine Valley citizens. Abigail's seamstress business flourished, as women who had previously hesitated to patronize her shop now arrived with commissions and friendly conversation. Her circle of genuine friends expanded beyond the running bears, and John Eagle to include Sarah Collins, Mary Fletcher, and even Elizabeth Carson, who had taken a position assisting Reverend Simmons with the church's charitable efforts. The small guest cabin on the Running Bears property became truly Abigail's home, with Matthew helping her add shelves for her growing collection of books and Sarah teaching her traditional beadwork during the long winter evenings. The Singer sewing machine, fully repaired by Mr. Dawson, hummed steadily as Abigail created garments that blended Eastern fashions with practical frontier adaptations and occasional touches of native-inspired embellishments. Most significant was her deepening relationship with John Eagle. Their courtship proceeded with deliberate care, mindful of the scrutiny they still faced despite Pine Valley's evolving attitudes. John's position as manager of Double Creek Ranch had been formalized when the Harringtons, impressed by his handling of recent challenges, granted him a 5% ownership stake, an unprecedented arrangement that reflected his value to their operation. One crisp spring morning, nearly 6 months after the harvest dance, John arrived at Abigail's cabin with a proposal. The Harringtons were selling a small parcel of land adjacent to the Running Bears property, 30 acres with a natural spring and a small but sound cabin that had previously housed seasonal ranch hands. It would be perfect for a home of our own, John said as they walked the property boundary. Close enough to maintain our connections with Matthew and Sarah, yet separate enough to establish our own place in the community. Abigail studied his face, noting the careful neutrality of his expression despite the significant implications of his words. "A home of our own," she repeated softly. "That sounds remarkably like a proposal, Mr. Eagle." John's serious features relaxed into a smile as he took her hand. "Perhaps it is, Miss Harper, though I imagined something more formal when the time came." "The formal can wait," Abigail replied, her heart suddenly racing. "I'd prefer honesty." Over ceremony, John's expression grew solemn once more, though his eyes remained warm. "Very well. Honesty, then." He took both her hands in his. "Abigail Harper, I love you, not despite who you are or how you look, but because of the complete person you've revealed yourself to be. Your courage, your determination, your willingness to see beyond the boundaries others accept without question. These are the qualities that make you beautiful to me." He gestured to the land around them. "I cannot offer you the wealth or social position that Thomas Whitaker promised. Our life together would face challenges from those who disapprove of our union. But I can promise you respect, partnership, and a love that sees your true beauty, the beauty that emanates from within." Tears gathered in Abigail's eyes, not from sorrow, but from a joy so profound it could find no other release. "When I came west, I thought I was seeking security through marriage," she said. "What I found instead, through rejection and struggle and unexpected friendship, was my own strength. And in finding that strength I found you." She squeezed his hands, her smile breaking through her tears. "Yes, John Eagle. Yes to this land, to a home of our own, to a partnership based on mutual respect rather than arbitrary social distinctions." Their wedding, held in early summer in the meadow behind the Running Bear's cabin, united not just two people, but elements of two cultures. Reverend Simmons performed the Christian ceremony, while Matthew Running Bear led a traditional blessing that honored John's Navajo heritage. Guests included nearly everyone who had witnessed the confrontation at the harvest dance. Sarah Collins and her husband, Samuel Peterson, and his wife Harriet Dawson, Mary Fletcher with her new baby, Elizabeth Carson, and even Sheriff Miller. Thomas Whitaker was notably absent, having departed Pine Valley 2 months earlier after selling Crescent Ridge Ranch to a Denver businessman who managed the property through a foreman chosen for competence rather than social conformity. As Abigail and John exchanged vows beneath an arbor woven with wildflowers and pine boughs, she wore a dress of her own creation, not the slender silhouette favored by Eastern fashion plates, but a design that honored her natural form while incorporating elements of both Western and Navajo aesthetics. The bodice featured intricate beadwork she and Sarah had spent weeks perfecting, telling the story of her journey from rejection to self-discovery in patterns only those who understood the symbolism could fully appreciate. Standing before their friends and the community that had transformed with them, Abigail Harper, soon to be Abigail Eagle, reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment. She had traveled west as a mail-order bride, seeking security through marriage, to a man who had evaluated and rejected her based on arbitrary physical standards. That rejection, painful as it had been, had forced her to discover her own worth independent of others' approval. And in that discovery, she had found John Eagle, a man whose understanding of beauty transcended the shallow judgments of those who could see only surfaces, a man who recognized that true beauty emerged from courage, integrity, and the harmony of living authentically in the world. As they sealed their vows with a kiss, the assembled guests broke into spontaneous applause, not for a conventional union sanctioned by rigid social structures, but for a partnership that challenged those structures while demonstrating the power of seeing beyond appearances to the essential beauty within. "Hojo," John whispered against her lips as they parted, one word that encompassed the balance, harmony, and beauty they had found together against all odds in the unlikeliest of places. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.